We have a special speaker from today, Dale Nellor, who's with the North American Millers Association in Washington. Dale's a native of Wisconsin, a veteran around the Capitol, and he's going to talk about issues, I think, about what's happening in Lansing, or not Lansing, but Washington, D.C., which is a great topic, very important right now. I know National Association of Wheat Growers, which we are a member of, very intently following what's happening with the Farm Bill. And so with that, let Dale talk about what the issues are with the milling industry. And the millers are very important to us in the wheat business because that's where our wheat goes. So turn it over, Dale.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. Being in Washington, D.C., and being a farm kid at heart, it's refreshing to get out of town for a few days and walk around the fields. So I enjoyed the program this morning and the opportunity to already speak to a handful of you folks already. Just a little bit about the North American Millers Association. We are the trade association that represents the grain millers across the United States. Our member companies mill wheat, corn, and oat. They have over 90% of the milling capacity in the U.S., so we represent the vast majority of the milling industry. As mentioned earlier, we work throughout the value chain, whether it's with NOG or on the other side with the Bakers Association, retailers, etc. So some of the issues that I'll talk about today, a lot of those instances, we try to collaborate and work together as much as we can, because at the end of the day, if we're not aligned within the supply chain, it usually ends up worse for us long term. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of items today that is a focus and a priority for us in the milling industry. First off, research, and then I want to talk a little bit about food safety, allergens, consumer demand. That is an emerging topic that we are dealing with, and then I'll wrap up with some of the activities that are currently going on in Congress and related to public policy that we are following and engaged in. Just to start off from the research side, as millers, we truly understand it's about profitability. We talk about quality a lot and the importance of that, but at the end of the day, we understand from a producer standpoint that profitability is where the rubber meets the road. But with that being said, any opportunity that we can advance the research that we're doing to marry those two together, we are strongly supportive of that. There are a number of initiatives that we, as the millers, support. The Wheat Barley Scab Initiative, we're very actively engaged in that program. The ARS facilities around the country that deal with wheat and small grains, and then the ARS Soft Wheat Quality Lab in Worcester, Ohio. They do a lot of baking quality work there, and so we really support the work that they do, and also in collaboration with the Wheat Quality Councils here on the East Coast as well as in the Midwest. We really appreciate the leadership of Michigan State University, Dr. Olson and the rest of the researchers here. I think, at least when my group was with him, he had made the comment that a lot of the research that's currently being done is in the public sector. So whether it's at land-grant universities or with ARS. So it's that much more important that the funding and support for those programs continue to move forward. So we are actively engaged, not only from an industry perspective, supporting those initiatives, but also in Congress and in Washington, D.C. Because as I'm sure you're reading in the news, everything is sliding very smoothly in Washington, and it's very easy to keep programs funded and moving along at a good pace. Just seeing if you guys are awake yet. Pre-lunch Como. Moving on to food safety, allergens and consumer demand. It's always important to remember that wheat is a raw commodity. The flour that is produced from that wheat is a raw commodity and is grown in nature. But however, that wheat ultimately becomes food. And I was on a wheat tour in the Mid-Atlantic last week, and the picture is blown up nice. You see the deposit that a bird left on the wheat. That's one of the things that we're dealing with. A lot of times you have the ability to control your risk. In a case like this, where a deer running through the field, or in some other parts of the country, feral hogs, it's a lot harder. But what we are seeing in the milling industry is more and more pressure on food safety and allergens. There's a lot of different reasons for that. First and foremost is the Food Safety Modernization Act, known as FSMA, implemented by the Food and Drug Administration. They are putting much more emphasis on food safety and allergens and things like microtoxins. So not only have our member companies been dealing with the increased attention related to food safety, but also microtoxins. And how are we controlling the risk for DOM and vomitoxin? Those are conversations that are increasing as the inspectors are going through our milling facilities and asking questions of how we are addressing and how we are dealing with it. The second area is the recalls. Within the last several years, we've had a handful of recalls related to E. coli pathogens as well as peanut. On the peanut side, it was all about transportation. There was one rail car that was bringing a load of wheat into a milling facility, and one of the prior loads on that car was peanut meal. And it wasn't properly cleaned out. There was just a little bit caked in the corner of the rail car. Well, it came loose and went through the mill. So then they had a major recall for allergens. So those are some of the things that our guys are having increased attention and focus on. And then lastly, the good old state regulations. How many of you have ever heard of California Prop 65? Raise your hand. It's a fabulous, fabulous rule. Basically, what it is back in the 80s, California passed a proposition requiring the labeling of products that had chemicals known to cause cancer and birth defects. It is known as Prop 65. There's almost 1,000 chemicals that are currently listed on that list today. A lot of them that you're probably going to be familiar with. In 2016, over $30 million were paid in settlements. Here is an example of the warning labels that you'll see. The first one over here on the left, that's a Disneyland. They just have a placard right when you walk into the park, basically saying, guess what, there's a ton of chemicals in here that are on Prop 65, they may cause cancer, good luck. But from the milling industry standpoint, where it's become of interest to us, is last year they listed glyphosate. We all know what glyphosate is, main component of Roundup. That is going into effect this July. So what does that mean for the milling industry? Well, there's a number of steps you have to go through, and one, determining if your product has the residue, two, how much that product is going to be consumed on a daily basis by the average consumer, and then three, if it's under a certain threshold. Some of the chemicals listed under Prop 65 have a threshold level, some of them have zero. So if you have any residue whatsoever, you have to put this label on your product. Thankfully for glyphosate, there's a safe harbor. But what we have been having to do is start to work at collecting information, data, to understand the risk, understand what potential challenges might lay ahead. And we've also had to do education. It's been surprising, maybe not so much. Some of our Miller customers would call and say, so what point in the milling process do you use glyphosate and how much are you using? So they don't even understand what it's used for and where it's used within the supply chain. And we haven't even gotten to the point of even talking about what the residue level is, what the trace amounts are. Because there's a group out in the countryside that want zero. If you've ever heard a clean label, they don't want anything. Zero, period, end of quotes. Well, we've seen data where there isn't any glyphosate used, hasn't been used for over a decade, residue shows up. So how do you get to zero? But that's a question for a later day. But I raise this to you because these are some of the things that our industry and sector are working through and dealing with as we go down the supply chain. As it relates to glyphosate, I think we're in a good place. While the information and the data that we've collected so far is minimal, we believe that our current risk level is low. The problem with California is they have what they call a headhunter provision, which essentially allows anybody to go into a retail store, pull product off the shelf, and go, well, you don't have a label on it, so prove why you don't need to have a label, which ultimately leads to that $30 million in settlements, because nobody wants to have to jump through those hoops. But our early indications are, and as we've been working not only with NOG, the Bakers Association, the Pasta Association, we're feeling good. But it ultimately, for us, brings up some questions. How do we deal with these moving forward? And so from our perspective to the producer community, some of the things to think about. Again, going back to the earlier comment, think of the wheat that you are growing. Yes, it's a raw commodity, but it's food. That's ultimately going to end up on somebody's dinner table, not very far from the state it was in when you harvested it. So some things to think about, the agricultural practices. We heard today throughout the tour the use of good practices, whether it's fungicides, proper application. You know, that's one of the keys with glyphosate, using it properly, per the label. There's still some work to be done as to what that means, as to when you apply it. But it's all about doing the right thing for the end. Harvest. Have you cleaned out your combine from last harvest? Or does it still have stuff in it from the last go-around? You know, as a farm kid myself from northeast Nebraska, I kind of cringe at some of the things that my dad, rest his soul, did. He never cleaned out his combine. How we cleaned out the straight truck was with the first load of grain from the hogs that we had shipped to the packing plant, a month earlier. So there's a lot of different things you need to think about. The transportation. What were the things that were holding your truck or your semi before? Has it been properly cleaned out? Because these are all things that, unfortunately, from the milling perspective, we're paying a little more attention to. Because at the end of the day, that ultimately impacts the specs that our millers are having to deal with and receiving from their customers, whether it's in the baking sector or retail sector. And then lastly, storage. Are your storage facilities properly maintained, well handled? One of the things that have been raised as a question mark are ag bags. I don't know if you guys use them here in Michigan. Back home, we use it for silage at the feedlots. But in some areas, people are using ag bags at the end of their field to store grain. It's fast, it's economical, it's a good way to segregate. But we've also been noticing that there could be potential problems with spoilage and vomitoxin increases and pathogen load increases when using those. So those are all some things that you should think about, because that's what our guys are thinking about. We appreciate and understand the challenges that go into production and the things that you have to deal with. But at the same time, as I had stated earlier, the more we can work together throughout the chain, the better we're going to be off at the end of the day. Lastly, I just want to touch about Congress and public policy. Again, a well-oiled machine. Congress is doing everything fabulous. There's no turmoil. Perfect, right? Not so much. We're dealing with the Farm Bill. Some of the items and issues that we as millers are interested in, again, first and foremost, research. Many of our milling members also do food aid products, so we have an interest in the food aid title. We also have an interest in the conservation title and making sure the good, high-quality acres stay in production and don't get enrolled in CRP. Beyond that, we like to work again with our supply chain partners, whether it's NOG or other organizations, Farm Bureau, to support their priorities. As we know, crop insurance is a huge importance to the producer. So we try to be supportive and as helpful as we can on whatever topics they ask us to weigh in and be helpful with. Trade. Man, where to start? The way that this administration deals and negotiates with trade and works on the diplomatic stage is much different than past administrations. I think it's too early to tell if it's been good, bad, and unfortunately we may have to learn the hard way if their tactics are right. We're spending a lot of time on NAFTA and talking to the administration the importance of the milling industry. A lot of folks don't think of milling as a high, big export. They're kind of right. There is only a minimal amount of flour that is exported, but when it is, it's exported to Canada and Mexico. But more importantly, over $4 billion worth of baked goods are exported to Canada and Mexico every year. Number one and number two markets. So while it may not directly impact us, it indirectly does. So we talk about that a lot with the administration. One of the challenges the administration has had is their political personnel have been slow filling in slots. So like their ag negotiator just recently came in. Before him, they didn't really have a strong ag presence within the trade representative office. Now we do. He understands a lot of our issues. He understands the importance of ag, because he knows at the end of the day, ag is the tip of the spear as it relates to the retaliation. But as I said, only time will tell with how the strategy of this administration will work. You could honestly argue, we've been doing the same thing for the last 30 years. Maybe it's time we shake it up. The unfortunate thing is we may have to learn the hard way if that works or not. It's either going to be great or it's going to be rough. So we'll just have to wait and see. And then lastly, on appropriations, very similar to the Farm Bill, a variety of issues that we're working on. Again, research. I heard today the challenge and the frustration with trying to keep ARS facilities open. That's a constant struggle we're dealing with. Not only keeping it open, but help increasing their funding. Because one of the challenges we're running into now is their funding is only covering their current costs that they have and can't expand. Wheat has the same issue as other commodities, but right now we're working on the oat sector, trying to get more dollars for oat research. So instead of taking 20 years for a project to get done, maybe it can get done in 5 like it should. So those are some of the things that we're working on. So with that, I'll just stop right there. Thanks again for having me. Appreciate the work that's being done here at Michigan State. Appreciate you growers, because I know you're all doing the right things, otherwise you wouldn't be here today. And so we really appreciate your efforts. And with that, I'll stop and answer any questions you might have.
Ned? California proposition you talk about. Why don't you tell all these business people just don't ship any food to California for 30 days? It'll change quick.
Yeah, not likely to happen. Some have suggested maybe California should just fall in the ocean. That would help too.
That'd be the best thing.
No, it's a challenge, and when we have such a integrated supply chain, it's hard to bifurcate. Nobody wants to, if you're a national brand or if you're shipping all over the United States, you don't want to have to do one thing for California and something else for the rest of the country. So, unfortunately, people will say, well, if we're going to do this in California, everybody's going to do it. Unless they have the opportunity to be able to segregate their product lines. They have multiple facilities. Any other questions? All right, thank you.